Good morning, church. Today's scripture is from Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon, and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing idle all day?" And they said to him, "Because no one hired us." And he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When the evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those that were hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received a denarius. Now, when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they grumbled against the landlord, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give this, the last, the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am so generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last.
Now, some Sunday I will preach, and I'll use that song as my text. I was reading in the newspaper with alarm the other day that in the quote-unquote detention camps, which are a little more than concentration camps, the ones that are being run by private companies, they're actually having people who have been detained engage in production labor. And they're actually having them make things for profit for the private companies that they're in. So as I heard you all singing this song, I was thinking to myself that someone needs to go to the detention centers, the concentration camps, and say, "Let my people go. Let my people go." But that's for another Sunday. That's for another Sunday. This Sunday we are going to spend a little bit of time with the story that is always near and dear to my heart, the one about the laborers in the heat of the day. The laborers in the heat of the day. And the reason why I say it is close to my heart is because as a child, when I spent my summers in North Carolina, we were working in the fields. So when people talk about being in the noonday sun and working in the field, I am too familiar with what that is. So when I read this text, I can see why the people got angry and annoyed, because having been early in the fields, I can remember those who came late. But as I'm reading this text, what I'm thinking is that the text tells us something which is deep in something to do, that is deep in God's relationship to us, something about the workings of grace, God's way of being in the world. As with so many of Jesus' stories, Jesus' parables, the first layer comes with the telling of his telling of the story. So there are always multiple layers. We're only going to touch on about 2 or 3 this morning. But the first I want to point to is that Matthew is recalling and telling the story of Jesus telling the story. So that's the first point, is that we have to be reminded that someone is telling the story of Jesus is telling the story. So the first layer calls to memory that Matthew was writing this recollection at a time when the Christian community was in transition. Transition from being a largely Jewish movement to one that was grappling with the success of Paul's mission to the Gentiles. Because when the Gospel of Matthew is written, Paul has already exited the scene. He's already done all of his ministry throughout the Gentiles, and it has been largely successful. All throughout Asia Minor, there are churches that were planted by Paul and his followers. So when Matthew is writing this text, likely in the last 2 decades of the first century, that mission to the Gentiles was beginning to bear fruit. When Matthew is remembering this parable, it is at a time when the Christian movement was but a few years from becoming a majority Gentile movement. So he's writing this at a time when the Jewish Christians, who had been the majority, are becoming the minority in the Christian community. Now, let me pause here for a moment to remind you that all that Gentile means is not Jewish. That's all it means. There's no group of people, per se, that were the Gentiles. It was just everybody else in the world that wasn't Jewish. So when we talk about that time in the church's life, the Gentiles were all kinds of people who spoke different languages, came with different customs, different beliefs of how people ought to be in the face of God. And so when we think about this, it's not that there is just one static group and then there are the Jews. There are all these other people from different places, different locations that were forming the church as well. So the second sort of layer of the reading is that the audience to which Matthew was writing in this mix were largely Jewish. So his was a Jewish audience. That's who he wrote this gospel to, the continuing and remaining Jewish community. So his hearers, Matthew's, and by extension Jesus' hearers, would have been believers who primarily understood Jesus to have been the fulfillment of God's promise to Israel, God's promise to them. That's how they would have interpreted. That's how they would have thought about Jesus. In fact, there was even a movement, and we hear echoes of it in Paul's letters, that was called the Circumcision Party. And they were the group of people that said before you could be a Christian, you had to convert to become a Jew, because only Jews were legitimate followers of Jesus, who himself was Jewish. So this is the second layer, is that the promise made to them in the covenant in Sinai was the important piece about following Jesus. Fidelity to that, which had gone through ebbs and flows of a few thousand years, was what it was that gave them the mark of the people who were the legitimate followers of Jesus. Now, to this audience of Matthew, they were the ones who had been in it for the long haul. They are the ones who had been faithful to God in the fields of the scorching sun since the beginning of time. And at this moment, they were living through the movement, or rather through when the followers of Jesus were not just Jews, but they were everyone else. Roman, Greek, Assyrian, Egyptian, Ethiopian, and even travelers and merchants from as far away as India. And it seemed that the more the promise of salvation through Jesus Christ was proclaimed to all of these people, the less important it was to be Jewish, being the first followers of Jesus. Now, if you want to get a sense of how difficult this makes for times to be, that how difficult Matthew's times were. Think about our own times. Our nation is being rent by the same forces that Matthew was writing about. There are many who believe that while words and ideals like we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal and endowed by God with certain inalienable rights, and we, the people, that while these words are clear and that they come without disclaimer or qualification, there are very many people who believe that these words should apply only to some people and not to everybody. There are people who believe that these words are not meant for everybody. These people believe that those who come of different hue or tongue ought to be satisfied with something less than full participation in the promise, and that they, and this is the white Christian nationalists, ought to be the first in line for everything. And our nation is being torn apart because of that. These are the same forces that were going on in the early life of the church. You had the folk who were saying, we were here from the beginning. This is our faith. Who are you to say that you have a place in this faith just because this guy named Paul came selling you a bill of goods? So the same tensions that are so real for us today were alive to Matthew. And so the recollection of this parable of Jesus, because remember, whenever you're reading the parables or anything else that Jesus said, those are people remembering specific sorts of things to answer what was questions that were in their mind, because Jesus had been preaching steady for 3 years, 3.5 years. And I know I've been preaching steady for almost 3 years. And some of you remember a little bit about what I said. Some of you remember this sermon. Some of you are kind and pretend that you remember something I said a few weeks ago. But the point is that we get snippets, and usually the gospel will lift up a snippet that is speaking to the moment in which the writer is writing. And so at this crucial moment in the life of the faith, this was the one that Matthew remembered. It was at that moment when the faith was discerning whether the promise of salvation was available in a come-as-you-are invitation to all, or whether it was just for a select few who had been there from the beginning. Now, let me make something clear here. When I'm talking about the Jewish followers of Jesus, that's who I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the Jewish people, per se. I mean, one of the great crimes of our time, which has been a crime of human history, is that people want to juxtapose the followers of Jesus from the rest of the Jews that were in the world. God is faithful to God's covenant. We're talking about folk who are followers of Jesus. Now, what I want us to look at and be concerned with in this text are those for who God's reasons and purpose were called in the name of Jesus, and their feelings about those who came after them. That's what I want to focus on, those who followed the call of Jesus, but then got kind of funny when other people started following Jesus. I want to draw attention to those who became the bearers of our faith, but then when the faith became unwieldy, and it came with a complexion that they weren't accustomed to, when it came with a voice they weren't accustomed to, then they started getting funny about it. When they started getting funny about those who migrated to the faith and were not born into it. Now, the story of the laborers was then a way to say to these first Christians, the Jewish followers of Jesus, that God's abounding grace and love ought not be a source of resentment. So that the fact that God is generous with God's love, that God's love is abounding, that's really not a reason for you to get resentful. That's not a reason for you to get angry, because it's not all about you. So therefore, God is being unfair to you because it should be all about you. You know, you sort of think about, I'm thinking about our two little ones today. You know how siblings, and Kirk, you know how this is when you start doing something nice for one of the siblings, the other one is like, well, wait a minute. Why are you doing something nice for her? Don't you see me here? And I know that the older they get, the more it's going to be the case that, well, wasn't I here first? You know, why are you taking so much time with that one? Well, I mean, and so what the text is saying is that that ought not be a reason for resentment. It ought be an opportunity to build a wall. It ought not be an opportunity to build a wall to keep these newcomers out. A wall of circumcision. No, they should be seen as God's great gift of salvation that is available to all, no matter when they join the journey. And that doing that ought to be our model for how it is that we share the good news, how it is that we share the joy of God's salvation, the grace to which we all should reach. Now, I think that this is a word for us today as well for two reasons. First, because it gives us an anchor in these turbulent times of evil and lethal xenophobia. That the grace of God, but not just the grace of God, but that whatever it is that God had put in the imagination of the people who said that all people are created equal and have inalienable rights, whatever it was that God placed upon their hearts, that the image of we the people and not just we the few ought to be adequate for building a nation for us all, that we take guidance from that and that we recognize that that is a good and it is a precious thing. Second, and this is the one that I am more concerned about, we have more and more people coming to church, big C and little c, who are not cultural Christians, who didn't grow up in church, or who left it at some time in their life. And we, as in other times in the church's life, can receive these precious gifts of people that were sent to us by God. We can receive them in wonder as a new thing that God is doing in our midst, or we can try to make them look just like us. We can try to make them do all the things that we did. We can try to make them understand the faith that God taught us, instead of recognizing that God is doing something new and that God is creating a new church in our very midst. That was the thing that the hearers of this parable that Matthew recounted were having trouble doing. They were having trouble welcoming and seeing that God is doing something new and wonderful, and we ought to give thanks for that. Now, as I started from the beginning, I said that I worked in the fields of North Carolina, and Susan will tell you that when I and my cousins get together and we start to share those stories about being out in the field, we all get very stricken looks on our faces, our voices become very grave, and there is very little joy and laughter in Mudville in those conversations. But one thing I do remember is that with each person who joined the work crew, each person who either was working at the barn, working on the harvester, or was picking with each new person, the work crew became different. because they brought their experience, their personality, their particular way of being human, so that who you started out with in the morning is not who you ended up with in the afternoon. It was a very different thing. And that's the thing for us to find joy in, not reason for us to be resentful because things have changed. Not reason for us to try to close the doors because there are so many people that are not like us. And when I say not like us, I'm going to be honest with you. When I look at the Grammy Awards, and I don't even look anymore because I don't know the music, I don't like the music, I can't understand the music, the rhythms, and I see the heads moving back and forth, and I just say, you know what, I'm glad y'all are having a good time. I want to enjoy it with everything. Because we should rejoice that God is sending us new people. And so, for me, I think that I will just find joy that there are more hands and hearts available. Because that's the other thing about when the work crew sort of expands with these new people that come later in the day. There's a little bit less work for the rest of us to do because there are more laborers in the field. And so I rejoice that there are more people to carry the light of God's love in the world, to carry the light of God's mercy in the world, to carry the light of the gift of salvation. And so for our text for the morning, I think that that's what Matthew was trying to get at. He was trying to remind us that indeed it is a good thing when God sends us people who don't dance to the same tune that we dance to or sing in the same key that we did, who don't move through the world with the ways of understanding the world that we do, but who have come because the Spirit has moved in their hearts in such a way that they become laborers with us in this great love, this great work, rather, of sharing God's love to a world that needs it so desperately. Amen.